Good morning. The commentary and the homily and readings this morning are from the 20th Sunday of the year. This year, that's August 20th, 2017, the day before the eclipse. So you'll have something to meditate on when tomorrow you go out and see the sun go into dark mode. First reading is from 3rd Isaiah, from Isaiah 56. Thus says Yahweh, observe what is right, do what is just. For my salvation is about to come, my justice about to be revealed. The foreigners who join themselves to Yahweh, ministering to him, loving the name of Yahweh and becoming his servants, all who keep the Sabbath free from profanation and hold to my covenant, them I will bring to my holy mountain and make joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be acceptable on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Word of the Lord. Trust that last line sounds a little bit familiar. That's one of the things Jesus says when he purifies the temple in the Gospels. Second reading is that very famous "What do you mean us?" pale-face reading that I've referred to before from Paul's letter to the Romans, certainly emphasizing that Paul's a Jew, will die a Jew, and he's bringing up how come he's converting Gentiles to Christianity if he's gung-ho about Judaism. He tells us that here in chapter 11 of Romans. Brothers and sisters, I am speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles. I glory in my ministry in order to make my race jealous, and thus save some of them. For if their rejection is a reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? For the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. Just as you once disobeyed God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, so they have now disobeyed, in order that by virtue of the mercy shown to you, they too may now receive mercy. For God delivered all to disobedience, that he might have mercy upon all. The word of the Lord. Today's gospel passage from Matthew is one of those rare examples where scholars point to the historical Jesus to say, this is probably what a first third of the first century CE Jew would do when he is talking to a Canaanite, a Gentile back then. Mark has the more original form of it. Matthew has doctored it up a little bit to make it sound like Jesus is just testing the faith of this Canaanite woman. Luke, who copied Mark, found it too hot to handle. He just left it out of his gospel. It was kind of unchristian of Jesus to say what he says. And so it's from Matthew 15. At that time, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and behold, a Canaanite woman of that district came and called out, Have pity on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon. But Jesus did not say a word in answer to her. His disciples came and asked, Send her away, for she keeps calling out after us. He said in reply, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But the woman came, did Jesus homage, and said, Lord, help me. He said in reply, It is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. She said, Please, Lord, for even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the table of their masters. Then Jesus said to her in reply, O woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish. And the woman's daughter was healed from that hour. The Gospel of the Lord. As I mentioned, Matthew kind of doctors up the story that he found in Mark and says it in a doctored up way, the reading I just proclaimed. In Mark's Gospel, the Canaanite woman, the Gentile woman, comes up to Jesus and asks a favor, just as she does here in Matthew. And Jesus says the same thing, basically saying, you don't take food that you prepared for children and throw it to the dogs. Now, she's a non-Jew. She's like a Palestinian today in Israel. Somehow or another, when the Israelites conquered Palestine, they never got rid of all of the original inhabitants, the Canaanites. And so, at the time of Jesus, over 1,000 years after the conquest of Palestine, you still had Canaanites around people, just like Israel still has Palestinians around there today. And so, frequently, they were called the dogs by Jews. They did not like these individuals. They'd prefer they get out of Palestine as quickly as possible and leave it to the Jews. And so when Jesus calls her a dog, he's basically echoing the phrase, I guess, or the word that his fellow Jews would use against these poor people in there. And in Mark's gospel, she comes back with the same thing she does in Matthew, in which she simply says, but if you got kids and dogs in your dining room, you're going to know where the dogs will be during the meal. They'll be under the chairs of the kids because they'll be eating the scraps the kids drop. Now here's where it's different. In Mark's gospel, Jesus says, woman, for saying this, go home, your daughter's going to be okay. Matthew changes that around and says, boy, you got a lot of faith, woman. That's not what Mark's Jesus says at all. And scholars point to Mark as being much more historically accurate because in that culture, people publicly would exchange short, pithy little sayings with one another. Things that you and I would look at today and say, oh my gosh, how can you do that? Or how can you say that? Back then it was like, oh, you expect if you throw a saying out like she does, where you got kids and dogs eating, you'll know where to find the dogs. Jesus somehow or another has to top that saying. And in a sense, he can't. She topped his saying about you don't take food meant for kids and throw it to the dogs. And so in a sense, Jesus is saying, you won. You got a better saying than I have. Go home. Your daughter's going to be okay. This bothers us because we would say, why does Jesus do this? The gospel Jesus might not do it, but the historical Jesus would have done it that way. I have a friend, for instance, who at garage sales does not like to negotiate with people over the price of items. She would just rather pay the price that's listed on the object, or not buy it, or just forget about it. Sometimes when I've been negotiating, she tells me she's embarrassed by my negotiation. I remind her, this is not Famous Bar or Macy's or something. This isn't Walmart. You start negotiating prices in Walmart, they push a button under the counter, and before you know it, 2 security people are on either side of you saying, what are you doing? Garage sale's different. Jesus' culture is different from ours. What would be an insult in our culture was simply an expected thing in that culture. And so it's kind of interesting that you have a story which in Mark's gospel really mirrors the actual historical Jesus. That's been doctored up by the time it's copied in Matthew to make it look like a test of faith, and is totally omitted by the time you get to Luke, who simply says, that's too hot to handle. I'm not putting that in my gospel at all. And so you have something, though, that mirrors part of the issue the historical Jesus had to face. Non-Jews. Now we know from his saying in this particular pericope that Jesus says, I wasn't sent to Gentiles. My job is to help convert my fellow Jews to the faith of the biblical authors, especially the prophets. I don't have anything to do with Gentiles, with Jews. Now, as far as we can tell, that's probably a real accurate description of the historical Jesus. But you have to deal with the fact that Gentiles still make up the majority of this planet. So even if you're Jewish, somehow or another, you have to deal with the fact you're a minority in a Gentile world. 3rd Isaiah, that first reading that I just proclaimed, deals with Gentiles in a sense to say, well, even Gentiles can be ministers of Yahweh, but they have to convert to Judaism first. That was the big difference. No Jew would argue with 3rd Isaiah. They would just say, you're awfully optimistic. How are we going to convert these Gentiles? But third Isaiah is at least, I guess you would say, rather orthodox in his approach to Gentiles. Sure, we permit Gentiles to do Jewish things, but they have to convert to Judaism. If they're male, they have to be circumcised. They have to commit themselves to following the 613 laws of Moses. But even if they're Gentiles, they can still be good Jews. Now, that's not what Paul deals with, though, in that second reading. Paul was the ultra-liberal of his day and age in Christianity. Most Christians, Jewish Christians, would agree with 3rd Isaiah to say, oh, if Gentiles want to follow Jesus of Nazareth, they have to become Jews first. They have to go through circumcision if they're male. They have to follow the 613 laws. Paul says, no, they don't. Paul says, all they have to do is have faith in Jesus of Nazareth, give themselves over to the risen Jesus. That's why Paul can say what he says, because he follows not the historical Jesus, but the risen Jesus. Remember in chapter 3 of Galatians, Paul says the historical Jesus, when he died and rose from the dead, or at least before his resurrection, was a free Jewish male. But when he rose from the dead, he broke with all those restrictions. When he rose from the dead, he was just as much a slave as a free person. He was just as much a Gentile as a Jew. And the thing that we still haven't come to grips with in the Catholic Church, he was as much a female as a male. And so Paul would say, if you are other Christ, you are other risen Jesus. You're not other historical Jesus. So Gentiles don't have to follow this. But at the same time, he reminds the Gentiles, as I said in that little one-sentence introduction, that I'm not converting you because I think you should necessarily be converted. I'm converting you simply because I want to convert my fellow Jews. My conversion and my apostleship, as he says in Romans, to Gentiles, has an ulterior motive. I am more than anything committed to making my fellow Jews other Christ. And so, as I say in my commentary this week, he follows a Mark Twain. I'm reading a book on John Wayne, that's why I make these Freudian slips. He follows a Mark Twain methodology. Remember Tom Sawyer painting the fence? He gets his friends to paint the fence for him by making it look like this is the most enjoyable thing I could ever experience, and after a while he convinces his friends to do it. Paul says, when non-Jews are converted to Christianity, my expectation is they will have so much fulfillment, so much joy in being other Christ, that my fellow Jews will look at them and say, we're crazy for not becoming Christians. If this is happening to non-Jews, think of what would be happening to us. And so when Paul stresses this concept of his methodology, he's constantly reminding people that I'm in this business of converting Gentiles so that out of jealousy, Jews will also convert to Christianity. It's kind of interesting. So if we still have Jews in the world today, following Paul's theology and his reasoning, it's not the fault of the Jews. We don't look at them and say, oh, you poor people, how stupid can you be not following Jesus? Following Paul's theology, we should look at ourselves as Gentile, non-Jewish Christians and say, what are we doing wrong not to be fulfilled enough to make Jews jealous of our faith? That's a totally different picture. That's why, as I say at the end of the commentary this week, the proof is in the kosher pudding. We, Gentiles, are the cause of Jews not converting to Christianity. The Jews are not responsible. And until we understand the importance of our role in being other Christ, other risen Christ, nobody's going to convert to Christianity who's Jewish. They'd be crazy to do it because the jealousy element is not there at all. Thank you. Enjoy the eclipse tomorrow. Bye.